first speaker is Peter Klepec, who is an associate professor at the postgraduate school and a research advisor at the Institute of Philosophy. His research is based at the intersection between French contemporary philosophy, German idealism, Lacanian psychoanalysis. He's published numerous papers on the likes of Kant, Hegel, Lacan, Deleuze, Badiou, Foucault. He's authored 3 books, The Emergence of the Subject in 2004, The Profitable Passions in 2008, and The Matrices of Subjection in 2019, and is currently working on a book on nightmares. Today, his paper is titled On the Element of Surprise in Philosophy and Psychoanalysis, where he's going to be exploring the importance of surprise within psychoanalysis. So, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you. What I'm going to talk about is the simple idea, very simple idea. I'm not developing it here, but this simple idea somehow concentrates on the idea that psychoanalysis is a kind of a special science, a science that works and proceeds in a very special way. In a way, the expression itself is perhaps bad. It brackets, it puts in parentheses for a moment when dealing a particular singular case, all knowledge that it has. So it is always starting from a scratch. It's always connected to elements of the surprise, which are, of course, formations of the unconscious. So here I will concentrate on one very short Lacan's text. It has 10 pages, Méprise des sujets supposés savoir from 1967. And basically my talk will try to give the idea what's this Lacan text all about, I guess. So in a way, as Alenka yesterday already pointed out, Freud in the interpretation of dreams somehow doesn't proceed too quickly. He always he has this supposition in a way that ça parle, it speaks, let it speak. So keep quiet, shut up for a moment, and it will produce some knowledge because it supposedly knows. And as Amanda mentioned before in the discussion, in Lacanian, the 17th seminar says, say anything and it will be marvelous. So this is the basic supposition of psychoanalysis. I'm not really going into the difference to philosophy, because philosophy mainly deals with dead authors in a way, so they cannot object to the interpretation. Whether they are undead or dead or alive, they are somehow awakened, I would say, as Alenka yesterday mentioned. So they ça bouge. So it doesn't leave you to do whatever you want. So I will give you a sort of a panorama here of the problem of surprise in philosophy, only in order to elucidate some of Lacan's points, in a way, in his text, Méprise des sujets supposés savoir. I mean, the philosophy and psychoanalysis share at least this fate, or something, that they are both contingent in a sense that they were born in a place and at the time that they were, in a way. It's nothing arbitrary, in a way. Huge volumes were written about it. This is not something arbitrary that philosophy was born, as yesterday Lorenzo and Mladen discussed in a discussion. But it's contingent. In a way, it's contingent. And here I rely on Deleuze and Guattari's line from What is Philosophy, that wrote like this: why philosophy in Greece at that moment, they ask. Why capitalism in these places and in these moments, in this particular moment? So this is the topics that somehow from the start philosophy relates to the topic of surprise and contingency. And the same applies to psychoanalysis. Why at Vienna at the turn of the century? And this is something contingent, but not really quite arbitrary. So So Deleuze also developed some thoughts in his Difference and Repetition that philosophy is a misnomer. So it shouldn't be philosophy, it should be misosophy. So because it starts with a shock, with something. So in philosophy we have, especially in Deleuze, we have these topics of surprise as a bad surprise in a way. Whereas there are, especially in Aristotle, there are famous cases in physics. There's the case that he mentions. There are, not so bad surprises, but pleasant, fine surprises when somebody goes to the market to buy some groceries and meets there a friend, so he says. So there are some sort of lucky encounters in philosophy. And I think that basically the problem, which I'm not going into, in philosophy is also related to what Jon Elster and later Slavoj Žižek developed as a category of essentially byproduct. This is also problematic of surprise. So, if we dive into philosophy, we can see that most of the time the problem of surprise is linked to the topics of contingency. And contingency is also played against the background of necessity. So everything revolves around the distinction what is necessary, that which must be the case, which cannot be otherwise, and that what is contingent, that which happens to be the case, but could have been otherwise. So, and these topics of necessity and contingency goes through the whole history of philosophy, from Aristotle in metaphysics, physics, and the Interpretazione, where he mentions the problem, which was later, especially in medieval age, quite in the center, the problem of future contingents, using the example of whether a sea battle will take place tomorrow. So, and Thomas Aquinas wrote about it, this problem. If God is omniscient, if God knows everything, so what happens with the free will, etc., etc. So, and the same could be said to the problems of somehow proofs of the existence of God are throughout history of philosophy also something that points somehow, as I will try to show, to topics that Lacan, but not systematically, somehow tackles in this méprise du sujet supposé savoir. Why? Because he mentions the classical predicates of God, such as omniscience, omnipotency, all these traditional predicates of God. So, and throughout history of philosophy, there's, for Leibniz, for instance, there's a famous distinction between necessary truths and contingent truths. And later in Kant, we have a priori, a posteriori, etc., etc. So, in Klepec, for instance, recently added to this necessary a posteriori truths, like water is H2O, a truth that is known through experience, but true in all possible worlds. So, in a way, throughout philosophy, surprise is tackled on the background of necessity. So, necessity and contingency are somehow played around. And this is important for our topics of sujet, supposé, savoir, because in a way, we will come to that. The problem of surprise, otherwise, could be also linked to critique of political philosophy or contemporary, everyday psychopathology. For instance, think about Žižek's example as kinder surprise, as a metaphor for ideology, etc., etc. So, this is basically topics that I will leave it out. In a way, we could say that for us, Lacanians, surprise is opposite of fantasy. Because in fantasy, everything is clear. There are no surprises, So you tame the surprise, you tame the contingency in a fantasy. And as Lacan says in television, we always understand only what fits into this frame of reference, which is fantasy. And as yesterday's talk of Arca showed, Lacan in seminar 9, somehow tackles also via logic this problematic here. Let me present you a joke which was not written by ChatGPT, but it sounds like it, you know. So, a philosopher, she is a logician, and she goes to hospital to give a birth. And spends the night there, eventually gives birth, and in the morning she calls her husband, who is not a logician. And obviously he asks her, is it a boy or a girl? And she answers, yes. Because for logicians, you know, there's no tertium non datur. There's only two possibilities here. So logic, there's no third option. And this is obvious, most clear in early Wittgenstein. For instance, in Tractatus, he says that because in logic we're dealing with signs and their necessary connections, and from there follows that, hence, he says, there can never be surprises in logic. So this is one line of thought which could not be further from psychoanalysis, because surprise is intrinsically linked to psychoanalysis through formations of the unconscious, and Lacan's category of the real, objet, subject, they all somehow reflect this awareness of the centrality of the surprise. And being a little imprudent, I wrote in the abstract in advance that psychoanalysis is the guardian of surprise. I will come later to that. I will present my self-criticism here. So, but somehow, in psychoanalysis, there's always a space for a category of surprise, or in Lacanese, for the real. And this is also very apparent in Freud, for instance, and here he differs fundamentally from Jung or Adler, as I think Amanda's talk yesterday showed about problem of symbolism in Jones, or about fixed symbolism, about fixed meanings in a way. So, I won't mention any other topics which could be quite handy. For instance, love. In Transcendence, we are dealing with love, and love for psychoanalysis is something connected with surprises, sometimes with nice surprises, sometimes with not so nice surprises. There are bad surprises too. In love, sometimes bad things happen. And as you know, Lacan, at the end of the 20th seminary, emphasizes to know what your partner will do is not a proof of love. Here, he's somehow discussing or criticizing behaviorism, Pavlovism, and all other, contemporary ideologies. We try to somehow tame the topic of contingency and surprise in a way. And Alejandro yesterday mentions the first big split in French psychoanalytic movement with Sacha Nacht, and this was also a major problem, was that this section that Nacht was leading was basically what today is naturalism, cognitivism, all about. So I use the term guardian, mea culpa, but the term may not fully capture what I intended to say in a way, because, the very term somehow sounds very Heideggerian, shepherds of being, etc. Somehow sounds very militaristic, even religious. But in the history of psychoanalysis, for instance, Freud had many options how to somehow save psychoanalysis, or save what psychoanalysis is about, by these infamous 7 ring bearers, by psychoanalytic association, etc., etc. And for instance, Lacan, with his invention of the matin, and and with many other things, was also heading in this direction, how to somehow safeguard what the psychoanalysis is about. And the psychoanalysis is about a surprise, about formation of the unconscious. And unconscious is something quite fragile. But in a way, we are all here, again, to my mind comes Amanda's joke about, Ubu's joke about Poles and Poland and everything. We are all centering about a central notion, which is basically unconscious, and we all count that it will speak, it will act in a way. As concerns psychoanalysis, as you know, Lorenzo mentioned yesterday also in the talk, in his text Triumph of Religion, Lacan was quite pessimistic whether psychoanalysis itself can resist being absorbed into culture and society. His conclusion was, a little pessimistically, that in the end the religion will triumph. But, as Lorenzo also mentioned, religion here for Lacan is something that is designed for curing men or humans, so they do not perceive what is not going well. So in a way, Lacan is here playing two sides: religion meaning world going well versus psychoanalysis symptom, the real not going well. And the same conclusion Lacan also wrote in the same year that this text that I'm talking about, Méprise des sujets supposés savoir, was also written. In his text, La Psychanalyse, raison d'un échec, so the reason of one of its failures, he says, it is when psychoanalysis will have been vanquished by the growing impulses of our civilization that the indication of Maïkri will be taken up again. So, yeah, in a way, in his interview for a Panorama, I guess, in the same time as Triumph of Religion, Lacan is not so pessimistic. He claims explicitly there can be no crisis of psychoanalysis at all. He's here pessimistic about religion, but he speaks about the revival of true religion. He says, what is a better devouring monster than a religion? But on the other hand, he has no doubts about psychoanalysis. He says is still something new, something young, which can and has to be retaught. So there are variations in Lacan concerning the fate of psychoanalysis, and there's a constant line of thought about religion. For instance, at the very end of his life, in his seminar from 18 March 1980, Lacan stresses that you have to know that religious sense will experience an explosion, va faire une boom, which you cannot imagine at all. So, but what I would claim here is that there has been a lot of discussion about yesterday, but religion here for Lacan is also some kind of philosophy. It's hermeneutics. It's hermeneutical philosophy. It's philosophy that somehow tames, in a way, surprise. Deals with the object of interpretation as if it would not move or object to its interpretation. There are many dealings with the topics of surprise in Lacan, not surprisingly in the 5th seminar, where he's dealing with formations of the unconscious, not surprisingly in the 8th seminar, where he's dealing with the topics of transference, and not surprisingly in the seminar 11, where in the 2nd lecture he presents his notion of unconscious, which he thought as an emergence, as an appearance. And he there somehow presents the topics of cause versus law. I think yesterday Alinka spoke about that too. So in a way, cause, says Lacan, has to be distinguished from that which is determinate in a chain, other words, the law. And there has been always something anti-conceptual, something indefinite, something that philosophy was embarrassed with the problem of the cause. So for what unconscious does, says Lacan, is to show up the gap. The gap, and here I'm quoting him, he's also somehow presenting the topics of surprise. I'm quoting him: impediment, failure, split. In a spoken or written sentence, something stumbles. Freud is attracted by this phenomena, and it is there that he seeks the unconscious. And here in this passage, he also mentions Theodor's Reich in an affirmative way. I'm not going into Reich. As you know, perhaps Reich wrote a book about surprise and the Psychoanalyst, which is a long book, 300 pages. But, and Lacan mentions his name here. What Lacan says here is also interesting because he says that this discovery of the unconscious phenomena becomes a rediscovery, and furthermore, it is always already, thus establishing, to resort to a metaphor drawn from mythology, he says, we have Eurydice twice lost. And this is important here. So Lacan presents here unconscious as discontinuity, and as you may know, he was quite dissatisfied with the very word that Freud presented, unbewusste. It was constantly something that he tries to find another words for. And in late Lacanian Seminar 23, for instance, even proposed that the unconscious as such is real. So real in the sense that it is distinct from a meaning, real in the sense of the surprise. And what is also interesting is that the very first Lacan, or early Lacan, somehow concentrated on laws, trying to find laws of language, of discourse, of speech, of signifier, etc., whereas the late Lacan concentrated on the real which is supposedly without a law, and the real, I would say, which is precisely something that should be taught as a surprise, as something encounter with the real is also something that that counts from this perspective. So I have only a couple of minutes left. Let me present the basic traits of this text, méprise du sujet supposé savoir. As you know, sujet supposé savoir is something that Lacan presented in his 11th seminar as a pivotal function, which is at the center of transference. And these days everybody asks ChatGPT questions, and this morning I asked ChatGPT, are you sujet supposé savoir? Are you subject supposed to know? And the answer is quite interesting. The answer is, I'm occupying position of subject supposed to know. You are positioning me on this position. But here's a twist, says ChatGPT. You are engaging me, but like any subject supposed to know, it is just a projection, and you should somehow desuppose this position for me. So the text, méprise du sujet supposé savoir, somehow begins with the line which is really a thread line throughout the text, you know, Lacan style. And Lacan asks at the very beginning, what is the unconscious? It is something still not understood. So it is shows thing which is not understood. And somehow the very words he used, méprise, should be should be somehow understood distinctly from the surprise. Surprise means to overtake, to seize unexpectedly, to catch someone off guard. While méprise is something closer to misunderstanding or mistake in a judgment, usually carrying a negative connotation. It implies that someone has misinterpreted something or someone. So méprise is a wrong understanding. And the idea that Lacan tries to convey is, in my opinion, exactly this. We, in psychoanalysis, starts from a sort of a failure, but then leave it to somehow repair the damage in a way. So Lacan here basically points out that psychoanalysis is not on the same level as other sciences, especially physics. And here it is important that he mentions famous Einstein statement that God does not play dice. Psychoanalysis is not a science like others in which one can rely on laws. And in psychoanalysis, unconscious appears in the form of a cause, which, as I mentioned before, is contrary to a law. So, in a way, unconscious always appears against expectations, even against expectations of the analyst. It is not unimportant that the text here is also contemporary with Lacan's 15th seminar, and in the first lecture of this seminar, Lacan criticizes Pavlovian stimulus response, behaviorism, etc. So exactly those versions of science which are in a way contrary to psychoanalysis. It is interesting that in the text, he is not developing systematically thoughts. He is using words like malin, referring to Descartes and his malin génie, Rus, invoking Hegel's cunning of reason, and he touches upon ideas of progress, progressivism, and albeit indirectly God, because he speaks about omnipotence and omniscience. He mentions that for Pascal, for instance, God is omniscient, but for him, subject supposed to know is not God. So, and he proposed here that that hermeneutics, which he describes as a kind of university of sanity, is to be opposed. So he's presenting here his version of understanding what méprise is about, and he uses German word vergreifen, which should be understood as a verb. So something that is constantly happening as a failure, as a méprise, and something which is not substantialized. We should recall here that he is using frequently, as Mladen Dolar in his book on officers, mates, and chimney sweepers showed, the Slovenian book, that he uses 7 types of, Verwerfung, Verdrängung, Verleugung, etc., etc. But here he uses the verb, vergreifen. Vergreifen, which somehow points to the direction that everything starts with a kind of a failure, which is not really a failure, which is supposed to be something successful. I should also mention at the end that for psychoanalysis, the formations of the unconscious doesn't mean that unconscious have to produce always something new. In this context, we could use the term developed by Nicholas Abraham, anasemia. Anasemia refers to transformation of meaning that happens when the same old words appear in a new context, in a new context. So, vergreifen, this is the very word that Lacan proposes for méprise, making mistakes, and psychoanalysis is for him primarily about surprise, about something that does not function well. And this is perhaps one of his variants why the very German name that Freud gave to unconscious Unbewusste, which was later also by Lacan proposed as unbewie, a gap, error, mistake, overlooking, is supposed to be somehow retaught, something that it does not work well. So basically for psychoanalysis, it knows, it's not God, but it knows, but first it does something wrong. Everything begins with a failure, mistake, or slip. And we could say that in a way, unconscious does play dice. It starts with a contingency, it starts with a mistake, and the task of the psychoanalyst is to figure out what is this dice about. So the task of psychoanalyst is not to understand that 2 plus 2 is 4, but actually to ask, the same as Klepec's skeptic paradox, whether this sign plus means cous or something other. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for some questions. Yeah, today, is there a roaming? Oh, there it is.
Thank you. Hvala, Peter, thank you. For this lecture, I have 2 questions, very short ones. Can you elaborate a bit on how the element of surprise functions outside the analysis and within the analysis? And the other comparison would be between surprise and trauma as regards the pleasure principle or beyond pleasure principle. I mean, so in a way, the trauma, as Freud describes it, right in the beyond the pleasure principle, is in a way something that has the effect of something quantitative in a way. So it's not. So there has to be the first step to even accept it as something. I mean, to transform it as something that can be elaborated and that can, you know, the defense could be triggered in the first place. So something that is really beyond even understanding in a way. So of the understanding of how psychic apparatus functions, right? In this way. So this would be the 2 questions. Is that okay?
Questions.
Well, you can choose, pick one.
Not surprisingly. So usually, how do we deal with surprises? We rely on our expectations, on probabilities, on laws, on what we know, on knowledge. So in advance, when a surprise comes, it's somehow we are not expecting it. So there are expectations and disillusionment, etc. So this is a normal way, in a way, normal human way. Whereas in analysis, it's a little more complicated, of course, but with all this knowledge about categories, I don't know, neurotics, psychotics, etc., the analyst is pretending somehow that he or she doesn't know. So he's not just saying, well, I know, you know, all these things. So you have to work it through. Durcharbeiten is basically a name, how to, you know, we all know that boys are in love with their mothers, blah, blah, you know. So, but you have to deal with it in flesh, so to speak it, so in person, in a way. The question of trauma is not something I was actually thinking about, so I'm quite thankful for this line of thought, and I have to, you know, I need some time for understanding, so.
Thanks so much, Peter, for this talk. It was really, really wonderful. Bringing together kind of some of the things you were saying about both transference on the one hand and surprise and love on the other, I couldn't help but think of this account that H.D. or Hilda Doolittle gives about her own analysis with Freud in her tribute to Freud. She says that there was this surprising moment when Freud was sort of frustrated with the lack of progress in the analysis, and he sort of throws down his notebook or something, and he says, "The trouble is you don't think that it's worth loving an old man like me. You know, this is why the analysis isn't working. You know, you think I'm too old." And, you know, she says she was really surprised and stunned by this moment because he was so wrong. And it was a kind of, I don't know, it's this beautiful moment in the book, in her tribute to Freud, and it helps me to kind of reframe what's happening with this notion of love specifically within the psychoanalytic setting. And I don't know, I wonder if it illustrates something for you too about how it is that the analyst, or Freud in this case, you know, wants to give what he doesn't have, which is just to allow HD to sort of fall in love with him, and this isn't working for some reason. So I don't know, there he's not so much in the place of the subject supposed to know, but it's the subject supposed to be loved. I don't know, there's just a number of threads there. I wonder if there's anything that resonates for you in that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Well, but there's also, thanks very much, Amanda. There's also the other side of the coin, that somebody is ugly as an analyst and still somehow loved in a way. There's a transference there. So.
Yes, Peter, thank you so much. I just have some sort of empirical comment. I have no experience with being an analyst or the practice of analysis, but I have ever so many analytic friends with whom I love to discuss their practice and the way they reflect upon their practice, and at length. And so years ago, I talked to Mustafa Safouan, who was, you know, one of the most experienced analysts or whatever, and basically what he said is, look, psychoanalysis is the most wonderful thing when it happens, but it happens very rarely. 90% of the time, I'm terribly bored. I struggle to keep awake, you know, because people's unconscious is completely boring, predictable. No, it's not like just let people speak and then something surprising will happen. Don't rely on this. Most of the time, the unconscious is inert. It just doesn't produce any surprises. And then what is the function of analyst in all this? And you know that Lacan says somewhere that in the 11th seminar that analyst is part of the unconscious. No, it's not someone out there. And basically, Safouan so is his task to somehow intervene and produce a surprise in order to wake people up. And if you look at Lacan's séance courte, this is the short sessions. This was a very simple mechanism to actually surprise the patient and make the unconscious work. Because one shouldn't rely on the unconscious being this contingent thing that will work by itself and produce surprises. Unfortunately, most of the time it doesn't. Mm-hmm. So it's just an empirical comment.
Thank you, Milan, for that. I fully agree with you. And I think that the factor of time, of urgency, is in play here in short sessions, of course, you know, because if the unconscious of the patient doesn't know in advance what will happen, it has to hurry up and to produce whatever possible. But I read somewhere that somewhere in the 60s, they transcribed the sessions, usual sessions, which were, according to IPA, 45 minutes. And exactly like that, 90% of the time people were just, you know, ill talk, you know, just speaking. And I agree that there are levels, so that even when you are dealing with the proper analysis, there are rare moments of the surprise. I completely agree, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. This was very interesting. I like the topic of surprises. I also wanted to share an empirical observation sparked by your question of the ChatGPT, whether it's your analyst or not, or if it could function as one. in early 90s, I was a bit of a computer geek, and one of the programs that was shared to me at some point promised a kind of a intelligent conversation, early 90s. And it was a very simple computer joke. It was just the therapist. I don't know how it was called, but it was basically a therapist. So the terminal looked like this. The machine would ask you, so what do you want to talk about? And then whatever you would say, he would respond with something like, aha, interesting, tell me more, or, the like. And then it was a little bit smarter. So if you use terms like mother, he would then comment, aha, your mother, now tell me more. And, kind of that. And if you entered a swear word, he would say, I see that this topic is very sensitive to you, and so on. You get a picture. So I suppose what I find interesting here, at least for me, is, this whole idea of projection of intelligence or projection of knowledge is something that is, it seems to me to be something very basic for any kind of interaction, not necessarily for interaction within a therapy, within a therapy situation. And it comes with all kind of questions of love, of power, even political power, and so on.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. No. That's it. It's just an empirical. I'm not sure. If I can easily make a point here, but yeah.
As a Lacanian, I guess I would say that in Lacan, we could trace many. For instance, his claim there is no meta language already points into this direction. His claim that you get your message in a reverse form from a receiver also points to this direction. And that is why for him, misunderstanding is the essence of communication. So, and therefore comedy and, and anything like that. So, and we could go also in this direction too, but, I left here only some threads that somehow illuminate quite dense text of 10 pages, where you cannot really know what does he want to say. And he's, as always, he knows what he's talking about. So that's the point. Yeah. No surprises will end.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.